Hey guys, welcome. So glad to
Hello.
see so many of you. If you have the opportunity, please turn on your cameras so that the speakers can also see your faces. Thank you.
I see some familiar faces. So great.
Yes, indeed.
So as we stated in the agenda today, we're going to be talking about GDP. And this is the first meeting of the IEOx training grounds. So I really hope that you find it useful and helpful. And I think I can give word to our first team leader is Shavash from Armenia. And he will talk you through the theoretical parts of the meeting.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. As Anna already mentioned, we are going to talk about GDP. At the same time, we will talk about aggregate demand. And we have made a presentation for you with some information. So let me share my screen. And then we will start to talk about everything. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So before we will start the presentation, I know that maybe some of you, for some of you, is the first time that you can, you have a chance to start the economics or to listen to training about economics. And I would like to know, do we have students who, do not have any kind of information about economics? And it will be really useful for me and very insightful if you present your imagination about the economics, you don't know what is it and what kind of imagination do you have about the economics. I'm waiting for the most courage person who is not shy.
Yeah, guys, you can turn on your mics or write it in the chat if you're more comfortable.
No one wants to say? Okay, in this case, I will start to talk about it. Let's imagine I'm the beginner of economics as well. Economics is a social science, and I think at least you have heard about it. And if we will try to explain with some a few words what is economics. Economics is a study, it's a science who tries to satisfy human unlimited needs with scarce resources. So what do we mean under this definition? You know, 1,000 years ago, there wasn't any kind of economical systems. People were just living like animals, fighting for food, etc. And after some civilization that the people started to have, they started to think that, okay, we have some limited resources and we need to distribute it to satisfy everyone because we can't fight every time for food. So let's think some models, some systems that can help us to satisfy our needs. And the science that started to work for that, by using the scarce resources from the nature to satisfy people unlimited needs, started called economics. And this is a little bit historical part how economics started to work. In today's training, we will talk about two main topics, GDP and aggregate demand. We will talk we will present all the details about all of them. After me, another team leader, Joseph, will start to present some practical part, and you will see everything that I present, the theoretical part, how you can use in practice. So first of all, we will see what kind of definition do we have for GDP. And as you can see, I'm saying the shorter version of this term. GDP, it's a gross domestic product. And what does it mean? I will let you know later. Then we will find what kind of calculation methodologies do we have for them. Of course, we will talk about main types of GDP. And in the end, we will talk about Gdp Deflator. I know that there are some phrases, some terms economical that you have started to listen about it only now, but no worries, like the presentation is not only for those who have already made some knowledge from the economics, also for those who are beginners, and that's why we will talk about all the details. If we will start to like give a definition for GDP, for gross domestic product, like first of all, I would like to mention that GDP is the key measure for the national income. What do we understand after saying key measure? It means that if we want to compare national incomes between countries, between nations, and we want to choose, there is a like kind of value of economical value that can help us to compare those economies, those national incomes. The best example of that is GDP. GDP is the total market value for all the services and goods which is produced over the period of time. Why we say goods and services? Because you know that during the last century, the market of services is becoming like larger and larger, and for most of the countries, the service section is more popular than the like for good production section. So that's why GDP will amount like summarize both of them, both goods and services produced over a period of time. Why we are mentioning this over a period of time? Generally, this time period we take as a year. We want to understand, for example, in 2020 or 2011, what kind of economies Armenia has and compare it with, for example, Russian economy or other economies. And that's why we need to fix a time for this comparison. Otherwise, I will start to talk, for example, for 1 year, Anna will talk about Russian economy for the quarter, and we will not be able to compare these two things. So that's why we need, first of all, to fix the time period. And GDP, we need to measure based on market prices. Why market prices? Because imagine if we will start to compare the amount of products instead of market prices. And I will say, you know, we have 10 tons of potatoes, and like another person, another economist will say, oh, we have thousands of tons. And to compare these potatoes will be really difficult, because maybe in my country, the price of potato is $1 and in another country is $3. And just compare the amounts, like the quantity of potatoes will be not beneficial for us, and we will have a lot of statistical issues. For that purpose, for not like do not have this kind of problems, economists have decided to measure GDPs based on market prices. Overall, like for GDP, we have a formula to calculate. And this formula includes like mainly four components, and the last component is the difference between two variables. As we can see from the picture as well, GDP is like the summary of the personal consumption for business investment, government spending, and export and minus imports. So I will talk about each part currently to understand how we can calculate the GDP based on these economical variables. Let's start from the, first of all, let's see which letter is like the opening version of the letters. The C is consumption, like basically is all the goods and services that are consumed by people during the period of time. And here I would like to talk about two important variables, consumers and customers. Like, do we have someone who knows what is the difference between consumer and customer? If you know, please unmute yourself and let me know what do you think, like the difference between customer and consumer. Okay, I will say again. I hope for the next question you will be more active, because I can't like talk every time only for myself, and I need your interaction as well. The difference between consumer and customer, the best example is the family. Imagine you need like a yogurt to eat, and you will request your mom to buy this yogurt for you. If your mom will pay for the yogurt and will buy this from the supermarket, she will be the customer for the supermarket. But actually, she is not going to eat this yogurt, and you are going to eat, so you are going to consume this yogurt. And you will become a consumer for this yogurt. So the person who will buy it, who will purchase it, will be the customer, and the person who will consume it, who will like use it, will be a consumer. So that's why we are saying consumption. And then I is investment. This is all the investment in the economy for both services and goods, for like in all the sections, in all the areas together, that within a period of time, like basically for a year, we can have it can be happening in the country. After that is government spending. I think you know that most of the things are free for use. For example, traffic lights or defense, etc., that you don't need to pay for them. And this is a part of government spending. Also, like education for some countries, like most of the countries, hospital and other public goods that are free for use. And of course, it is free for us, but for government is not free, and they need to spend money for that. So we call this all the transactions government spending. And of course, the difference between export and import. Why it is important to understand the difference between export and import? Because you need to have clear imagination, like, did you export more or import goods in your country? What kind of insight will it give you? Imagine you live in a country that importing more than export. It means that every time you will pay for something more than you will receive payment from other. So after some time, you will not be able to control your economy and you will go to the recession. And to understand, are you in a recession or all is fine in your economy? The economists calculate the difference between export and import to understand, like, are we going up or we are going down as an economy? So of course, we first of all, we compare GDPs for countries, like compare one country's economy with another country's economy. However, it is important to understand the comparison of GDP per capita or per individual. Why do we need it? Imagine we have two countries, and for both of them, we have calculated 3 billion of GDP. How to understand which country is performing better? First one or second one? You need to understand how much population do we have in their country. If the first country has, for example, 1 million population and the second one has 3 million of population, it means that the GDP per person will be 3 times higher in the first country than in the second country. So basically, they generated the same amount of GDP, like including all the goods and services, but because first country generated with less human resources and the second country will generate with more people, like more human resources, the GDP per capita will be higher in the first country than in the second country. And why do we need to understand it? We need to understand it to compare living standards between those countries. What do we understand by saying living standards? It means how individual lives in the country, like how much is high the quality of living for them. For example, are they all able to have higher education or not? Are they all able to use all the basket of goods for the first necessary things for people? Are they able to travel? Are they able to have like high quality life or not? And for that, the best measure for calculation is GDP per capita. And we can understand how much is GDP, my personal GDP, as a part of whole country. And these two together will explain, as you can see here, we have a nice diagram as well, which shows like the combination of standard of living and quality of life. So these two together, we will be able to understand by using GDP per capita. And of course, to calculate it, we need to divide GDP to the total population that we have. Imagine you have 3,000 of GDP and you have 1,000 people in your country. We will divide 3,000 to 1,000 and it will be $3. It means per person, we have $3 of GDP. At the same time, we have two types of GDPs. Like generally, if we will divide to like the types of GDPs, we have nominal GDP and real GDP. So first of all, let's read together the definition for both of them. Then I will present more details. The nominal GDP, as you can see, it's written is a value of the final goods and services that an economy produced during the given year. Real GDP is nominal GDP, so it means that it already includes nominal GDP. However, it is adjusted for inflation to reflect changes in real output. What does it mean? Imagine I'm asking to your countries about your country's economies, and you are saying that, oh, our country's economy's GDP has increased 20%. And I'm trying to compare with my country economy's GDP, and I can say that our GDP has increased about 15%. And I'm thinking, oh God, why like their economy is performing better than mine? But this is not a clear data to have this comparison, because I don't know about the inflation rate of your countries. Maybe you have a very high inflation rate, and that's why your GDP is higher than mine. Maybe I have produced more quantity. The consumers consume, they consume more amount of products, but with the same price or with the lower change of prices. And in your country, it's stable, you don't have any changes of consumption, you produce the same amount, but because you have higher prices, your GDP became higher. So how it's possible? Imagine we both are producing only tomatoes in our countries, and I'm producing 10 kilos tomatoes, and you also are producing 10 kilos tomatoes. And for per kilo, we are paying $1. So my GDP will be $10, and your GDP will be $10 as well. Next year, I'm producing 20 kilos of tomatoes, and you are producing $15 of 15 kilos of tomatoes. In this case, I'm not going to increase the price, and with the same price, my GDP will be 20 multiplied with $1, and I will have new GDP as a $20. You are going to produce 15 kilos, but with $2. So what will happen? Your GDP will be 15 multiplied with $2, and your GDP will be $13. So if I compare your country's GDP with my country GDP, I will have the following: $30 and mine is $20. It means, oh, your GDP is higher than mine. However, from the side of inflation, because you have 2 times higher inflation than me, I can understand that actually I produce more than you. And your GDP is higher only because you have increased the prices of your product and services. That's why we have 2 types of GDP. And the first one was nominal, which is without adjusted of inflation. And the second one is real GDP. So it shows the real value of your GDP. And it is like nominal GDP adjusted for inflation. So I will take account the inflation part as well. To understand how much was the inflation in my country, and for this comparison to have the formula, the economists decided to use the Gdp Deflator term, which is measure like the relationship between nominal GDP and real GDP. So you already, I guess, understood that real GDP includes nominal GDP as well. So it's logical that this formula will include both variables, and we'll start to understand like the proportion of real GDP and nominal GDP. If we want to calculate the Gdp deflator, it will be the nominal GDP divided to real GDP multiplied with 100%. If we, for example, have 20%, it will mean that the difference for them is 20%, and I have some kind of 20% inflation. And based on all the values, we will understand that the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, and we will understand, did we have the improvement of GDP thanks to our productivity, that we started to produce more and consumers started to consume more, or we just increased the prices and that's all. As a the economics is a science, and we love to present everything by using curves. To present information about GDP, economists started to use a term aggregate demand, and the word aggregate already shows that it is going to talk about the demand for the whole things of our economy. And to understand the diagrammatical presentation of GDP, which economists started to draw a curve and show everything on that curve. So for upcoming slide, we will start to talk about the definition of AD, of course, the component that AD has, and how like the curve is shifting to the right or to the left. So because it's basically similar to the GDP demand, for aggregate demand. So most of the terms that I will use, most of the components that we will discuss for aggregate demand, it will be the same that we have for GDP. But first of all, let's understand what is demand. Demand is, as we can see from the definition, is for an individual goods is defined as the quantity that is bought at the any given price. Why we are mentioning here that price is important? Imagine me and you are trying to buy new, I don't know, the chocolates for us, and we all want to buy it. But you have $2 and I have $10 in my wallet. And the price of chocolate is $5. Okay, we all want to buy it, but will you be able to buy it? No, because you don't have this money. It means that you have wish to buy it, you need the chocolate, but you don't have a demand for the chocolate because you are not able to buy it. And I am able to buy it, I want to buy it, I have an amount of money to buy it. So I will be a consumer and customer at the same time, and I will have demand in this case. I will have need and want, and at the same time, I will have demand for the chocolate as well, because I want to buy it, I am able to buy it, and I'm ready to pay $5 for that. You want to buy it, but you don't have demand because you are not ready to pay this price. The second component of aggregate demand phrase is aggregate. When we say aggregate in economics, it doesn't matter we are talking about aggregate supply, aggregate demand, or another term. Aggregate in economics means total or added up amount. So why we are saying aggregate demand when we are talking about GDP? Let's remember that GDP was showing the total amount of all the goods and services that we were producing during a period of time. So of course, we need to talk about aggregate demand instead of a simple demand. And we need to have information about the demand for whole economy. That's why we are calling it aggregate demand, which is a total of the demands or expenditures in the economy at any given prices. So as for GDP, aggregate demand also have 4 components, and the components again are consumption, government spending, net export. Next export is difference between export and import, and of course investment. Actually, when we say national expenditure, is one of the ways to calculate national income, and this is based on that we are starting to talk about the 4 components for aggregate demand on the GDP. When we say consumption, we understand that this is the spending by households on goods and services. Why we are saying households? Because households are our families, and including all the people that are living inside of the family. When we say government spending, I already talked about it, but let's read one more time. It's current spending, salaries, wages, investment of goods, new roads and schools, etc. As you can see, all the examples of government spending that we have here are public goods. We are not paying directly for roads. We are not, like for most of the countries, we don't pay for schools as well, for public schools. So all the things that government is going to make public and they are spending for that are a part of government spending. Net export, I already gave an example. Let's remind one more time that this is like foreigners spend money on goods produced in the domestic economy. It means that when we have export some goods and receive money for that, and we will import some goods and we will pay for that, if we calculate the difference between these two things, we will understand how much is our net export, and we will say, do we have economic development or not? Then the last one is investment. I already said is the spending by the firms on investment goods. So why we are saying by the firm? Because if companies want to produce something, if they were to have production for something, they need to have like equipment, to have raw materials, etc. And all these things they need to buy. Are they buying to consume it? No. They are buying it to produce new goods and receive profit from them. So that's why all the costs that they will do, they will spend this money for buying this equipment and other assets, we will call investment. And like GDP, aggregate demand has the same formula. Again, like the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and the next net export, which is export of goods and services minus import of goods and services. When we are trying to talk about aggregate demand, we are using the following curve, which, as you can see, it is like a curve which is going like sloping down curve, and it shows a relationship between two variables, price level and real output. Why we are taking these two variables, not other parts? Because when we buy something and we want to calculate the revenue or to calculate profit or to calculate the GDP for our country, let's remember that we were calculating all the amount of product based on prices. So I need not only the real output, the quantity of demand that I will have, at the same time, it's mandatory to have an information about how much is the price of my output, of my product. So the curve is, why curve is going down? It's very simple. The same product that will start to have lower price, consumers will start to buy with higher quantity. Imagine you are buying, I don't know, like you have $10 and chocolate kilos is $5. You are able to eat 5 kilos of chocolate, but you are not able to buy it because you have only $10 and you will buy only 2 kilos. When they will decrease the prices and they will make, for example, $3, you will start to buy 3 kilos of chocolate, because now with the same $10 you are able to buy more amount of chocolate. And the opposite, when they will increase the prices, the quantity demanded will start to decrease. On this diagram, as we can see, in the beginning, the price was P1, this is price 1. And at that time, the real output or the quantity demanded by the consumers was Y1. When they started to increase price from P1 to P2, the quantity demanded or the real output decreased from Y1 to Y2. Why? The reasoning I already mentioned. And we will have the changes along the curve instead of shifting of the curve. And each point of this curve will show us the relationship between price and real output. I can understand for each price the amount of quantity that my consumers will consume, that my society will have a demand for this kind of products, for this kind of output, for given prices. When we have changes of other factors besides the real output and price level, we are starting to have the shifting of aggregate demand. Why it is shifting? Because at the same time, not only price and real output are changing, also is changing other components that are changing the amount of our demand. For example, imagine you are receiving a salary and your company is increasing your salary. You will be able to buy more and your income will have an impact to shift this demand. Or the opposite, if they will start to pay less amount of money, or you will have some substitute of this product, etc., and this will cause to decreasing of aggregate demand, and as a result your curve will shift to the left. In this case, we have increasing of aggregate demand as we have in our diagram. That's why it's shifting from 81 to 82. So basically it was like all the information that I prepared for you today. So I said like the lecture part, and I believe that you will be active now more, and we'll start to ask more questions about everything, like the topics that I discussed, the formulas. If you need some examples, feel free. I can go over the slide one more time if you have make notes about the not clear parts. So it's up to you. Just ask me questions, and to sum up my presentation, I forgot to present myself. I'm representing Armenia, British International School of Armenia. And it's already second year that British International School of Armenia will participate to IEO. And we are happy that we can support for new beginners to be a part of this nice team. And I hope to see everyone in IEO 2022. And why not? Maybe for future we will have more meetings, and we will have like closer relationship. And for now, please ask questions about the topics that we discussed, like about everything. Even you will think that there is something very simple and, oh, it's shame to ask this kind of question. Don't think about it, because no one from us has been as an economist. We started to learn like this. So it's a good chance for you to ask questions and receive answers about everything.
Sure, thank you. Actually, while guys are thinking about the questions, we have discussed one question in the chat beforehand, before the meeting. It was a question about how could you double the GDP of one country in 1 year? And I think it brought some interesting answers, but I would love to hear what would you suggest, how can it be done?
Okay, like do we want to double our real GDP or nominal GDP? Like you want to have the real double or just amount like the nominal one?
That's an absolutely perfect question. And of course, by not specifying this, I gave a lot more of room to answer this. And let's try to answer the nominal one.
If we want to increase the nominal GDP, is very simple. It will not be the beneficial for the country, but I can just easily increase the prices and like to have the same production, like the same amount of production, and with the higher prices, like 2 times higher prices, I will multiply with the same the higher prices with the same amount, and I will have like, oh, I have doubled my GDP, but it is not the real picture.
Okay. Do you have other methods of doing this?
Me?
Yeah, could you suggest other methods?
The other methods we can use for real GDP as well, when we are starting to encourage consumption and encourage production of goods and services. How we are encouraging, governments are using subsidies for that. They are subsidizing some industries, some areas in the country, and those companies that are a part of this industry, they are starting to be able to increase their production level, and of course, if they increase the production amount, GDP will increase as well. At the same time, not only the subsidizing is the only methodology to encourage the production, we can decrease, like cut taxes as well. For example, if I want to increase the agriculture section in Armenia, I can say all agriculture producers, hey, like from today, 2 years, you will not pay profit taxes. Just produce as much as you can. And they will think, okay, I'm not going to like pay for profit taxes. I will spend the same amount of money that I was spending before for taxes, and I will like increase my production.
Could you maybe open the slide with the formula? Because I think we could.
This one or
yeah.
GDP one?
No, maybe the previous one with the text, so that everyone understands those letters that are in the formula. Yeah, no, backward. Yeah, no.
Oh, sorry.
Almost.
Like, I
one
think
slide back.
this one. Sorry.
Yeah, this one. Yeah. So you have suggested to rise the consumption, to rise the investment, to rise the government spendings. Could you work with export and imports?
Yeah, definitely. Like, but we need to have a positive difference between export and import if we would like to increase GDP based on that. So it means that I need to have more export than import, but I can't have more export like if I didn't increase like investment and consumption in my country beforehand, because first of all, I need to have this production and after that started to export it. And as much as I increase my export and at the same time, parallelly, I will decrease the import, which means what does it mean, decrease the import? It means that, for example, I'm not producing shoes in my country and I every time import from my neighbor country. From one day, maybe I will have some investment and will start to produce shoes as well. So I will decrease the amount of import of shoes. At the same time, I will start to export shoes because, oh, I'm already experienced shoe producer and I can export shoes. So with this methodology, I will be able to increase GDP as well, and I will have cash flow like an inflow in my country, and like real GDP will increase as well. If I don't have any, like, let's imagine that prices are fixed and we are working only for amount, like quantity of product, or prices are not too, like they haven't increased too high with the high rates.
Great, thank you. I think there is one more artificial way of increasing the GDP, but we haven't talked about a lot about the methodology of calculation of this, so I don't think we should dive into this now. But just know that it is a hard task to calculate the GDP. Like, you need to know everything that happened in your country in this year particular, and it's like a little bit.
Sometimes it is possible because there's a lot of hidden economics part, like illegal things, and maybe you will think, oh, like all is fine. I have calculated everything and I have statistical data about all the industries of my countries, but maybe someone is producing without paying taxes and you don't know about it. So yeah, it's very difficult. That's why it's like the main component, like of measuring the economy. And if you have the real one, you will be able to have the comparisons in the best way. Otherwise, you will fail.
Thank you. While we were talking, there are some questions in the chat. Maybe Anna, could you help us to name those?
Yeah, so the first question is there a difference between aggregate demand and total demand?
Actually, no. Like if we are talking about, as I already said, aggregate, the word aggregate, it already means total. And when we are saying total demand, under that we understand aggregate demand at the same time. So, but like from the scientific part, we don't say total demand of economy. We are saying aggregate demand of economy. So for companies, we use term total demand. For economies, for countries, we are using aggregate demand. But from the idea part, there is no difference. It's the same thing.
Okay, thank you for the answer. The second question from the chat is, should the government restrict imports to make net exports positive?
It's a very nice question. And to encourage domestic production, sometimes governments starting to have restriction for imports. Why? Because if like importing good, it's very easy, and some companies that have like enough investment and they have enough amount of money, they can just become resellers, buy like from buy the cheapest product from abroad and start to resell in your country. But because it is a part of import, it will make problems for you. You will have a lot of outflow of your money, and we will have a lot of import, which will have a negative impact on your country. And what governments do in these times, they are making some regulations on it for imports, and the producing in your country is becoming easier than import the product from other parts. In the beginning, it will make some problems for companies. However, for the long term, it will be beneficial for both companies and for your whole economy, for government revenue as well. And your consumers will start to consume your domestic, your local production, and it will be beneficial for them. So it's very practical to have restrictions on imports, not for every time. If it's possible to produce the same product in your country. And governments are trying to encourage domestic producers by making problems for importers. And after that, they're subsidizing them, like giving them chance to take loans without percentages, etc. And they're starting to satisfy human needs by using their domestic production. It's very useful thing. So most of the governments use it. Otherwise, they will not be able, without these import regulations, to control their government, their country's economy.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Could you please talk about whether coronavirus, the COVID-19, is actually favors for a country's economic development? Because actually the COVID-19, most of people killed by is those elders, so which will decrease the dependency ratio, and since the coronavirus will stimulate the consumption of some like the mask or something else, which can increase consumption. So I think so the money saved from taking care of of people dependent on young people, I think those money can be consumed or saved, so which will increase GDP further. So could you please talk about that? Thank you.
So the all the people actually it's how to say, like a fake imagination that the increasing of masks that can have a very positive impact on GDP, because even we use a lot masks, like the amount of price of the mask is very cheap, and at the same time that we are increasing the mask production, a lot of productions parallelly are decreasing because of COVID-19. And why GDP is decreasing during the COVID? Because first of all, there are transportation issues. Do you remember the formula of GDP? There is difference between export and import. And we will not have any kind of export in this case because there are restrictions. I hope you all remember that now more or less it's fine, but 2 years ago, it was very difficult to have transportation, distribution between countries. And because of that, most of the countries started to stop their exports, and that's why their GDP started to decrease. Even the consumption of masks or other related things started to increase. However, the amount of exports was they were decreasing with the higher amount. That's why their GDPs generally started to decrease. And at the same time, if we start to develop our country's economy's GDP and we will compare with the year of COVID-19, it will not be fair enough, because we had a pandemic situation when the conditions were different. And if I will have more money and will say, oh, look, I'm working now better, my GDP is higher than in COVID-19, it is not fair, because actually you are comparing with the lowest level. You need to take with the same, a year which has the same conditions, with the same requirements, and compare these two together. So to sum up my answer and to have answer of your question, yes, they were a part of GDP, but they don't have very high impact. The magnitude wasn't too high to increase country GDP. At the same time, they decreased other exports, and that's why they made problems for most of the countries that had issues for importing or exporting. And the worst thing that happened with countries, it was from the service side, especially for those countries who have they had a lot of tourists, and their the main part of their GDP was by the tourists that they had, they were coming, consuming their services, products, etc. And during the pandemic, they didn't have any kind of traveling, so it had a very bad impact on their economies.
Okay, thank you.
You too.
I have a follow-up question. So in my opinion, I think is that possible because the reason that why the GDP is decreasing, because producing mask is a consumer goods instead of a capital goods. So so that's and beside the COVID-19 will ban people to traveling. So the whole economy is a closed economy. That's the reason that the GDP is declining, right?
Yes, nice argument.
But I think GDP is the calculation of all goods and services produced in an economy over time. So both consumer goods and capital goods will also be taken into account.
Yeah. Yes, but I think because of the COVID-19, so the mask will become a majority goods to produce.
It depends, like from the size comparisons. Like if there are a lot of people, they are very afraid, and there are a lot of restrictions by the government regulations, and they need to use a lot of masks. Maybe it will have an impact, but in reality, there are no any economies that had like GDP improvement thanks to mask productions, because parallel other productions has closed and they were in recession. So they're in reality, like not only from the theoretical part, they aren't any kind of countries at all. They increased their GDPs thanks to the mask production. But both arguments are right. Like it depends from which side we will talk about it. Like if we will take ceteris paribus, like when all the things are the same or equal, your argument is right. And if we will compare with, we will include other components as well, then another argument is right. That's why in economics we have like ceteris paribus term, which means like when you are fixing some things and taking like one or two variables. And if you are taking all the variables, of course, the the image of the situation will be quite different.
Okay, thank you.
You too.
So there are a few more questions in the chat. I'll just read them out one by one. Why did people create two kinds of GDP, and which is better to use in the economy?
Definitely, if you want to have the real comparison and have the real picture of your economy, you need to talk about real GDP. But why they are like we calculate both of them? Because I can't calculate real GDP if I don't have the value of nominal GDP. Because to be able to calculate the real one, first of all, I need to calculate nominal one, which is just price multiplied with the amount of the products. After that, when I will have information about the inflation, I will be able to calculate real GDP. If we want, like, we have two choices. Like, imagine someone calculated for us, and you need to have only one choice, like with these two options. Like, oh, I can tell you all this information or this information. Which one do you need? Definitely, you need to ask about real GDP because it's already include nominal GDP and adjusted by inflation. So the best option, like when we are comparing the countries, we every time compare their real GDPs to have the real picture.
Okay, thank you. And what are the units in calculating the GDP? How are the consumption, investments, and etc. calculated?
I'm sorry, what?
What are the units in calculating the GDP? Like, how are the consumption, investments, and so on calculated?
Can I understand, like, what do you mean by saying unit? You mean what kind of value do we use? Like the amount of like price, or what do you mean by saying units? If you mean kilos, meters, I don't know, like size, like if you mean this part, I can answer to this question. If not, please correct me. Okay, let's imagine that I understood the question clearly.
Yeah,
and
they confirmed.
If it's like, for example, how I can calculate if I bought 3 computers and I'm saying 3 items, not kilos, 2 kilos of potatoes, and I don't know, 3 grams of chocolate, and like different measurement units. How I'm calculating this is very simple. Each one of them, they have prices, and I can calculate their quantity, like amount multiply with the prices, I will have the total price for each product. Then I will summarize all the prices together, like the revenues, and I will have the overall picture of my GDP. Free pieces, are they 3,000 AM like USD for per PC? It will be 3 multiply with 3,000, it will be 9,000. Then like if I have 2 kilos chocolate and $10, 2 multiply with 2, and it will be like $20. I want to calculate GDP. I will summarize, like calculate the sum of 20 plus 9,000, and my GDP will be $9,020 if I remember my mentioned numbers correctly. So I just need to calculate the each revenue from the each industry, from the each product, then summarize all the revenues, and I will have the GDP. That's why we are seeing with prices. That's why I mentioned there that we are calculating it based on prices, not based on the amount. And in this case, I don't have problems with choosing the units.
Thank you. And guys, please confirm if your question was answered so that we know that you have no more questions. So the next question from the chat is, doesn't restricting imports go against the law of comparative advantage?
Comparative advantage, like for domestic like producers compare with importers? Do you mean that?
We'll have to wait for Chris or Lucas to expand on his question.
Oh.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, like definitely yes. If we like they are competing two companies, domestic company and another company who is importing it, definitely when there will have like some restrictions for imports, you will have comparative advantage. That's why competitive advantage, sorry. That's why it is the best method by the government to encourage local production. If you don't have competitive advantage after this restriction, there is no idea, there is no like reason to have this restriction. They do this restriction especially to make you like more competitive, because you need to be able to compete, kind of kill your like importers and start to produce everything domestically. And yes, you're right. Definitely, your domestic companies will have competitive advantage.
And a follow-up question to that one.
There is like something, just to clarify, in GDP are the same quantities seen from the trend. Yeah, the amount is the same, like which you use just AD for diagrammatical parts. That's why when we are saying we are showing everything on diagram, we are saying AD. When we are just showing the numerical parts, we are calling this GDP. The amount of them is the same because they are, as you can see, they have the same formula. You just for representing them like diagrammatically and with numbers. This is the main difference.
All right, thank you.
You too.
And a follow-up to the previous question, imagine we have an absolute laissez-faire in the entire world and governments do not regulate imports and exports.
Mm-hmm.
Will the balance in the long run of trade in each country become positive or at least neutral?
It depends on the amount of export and imports. If they will increase parallelly, we will not have any kind of changes. If our export will be higher, then our balance will be positive. If importers will become like more powerful, in this case, it will be negative. To be able to answer to this question, we need to understand, like to have the data, like how much is the change? Okay, there are no restrictions, they both are working, but how much like have they increased?
Great, thank you. And next question is, what will happen if the aggregate demand of a certain country exceeds its supplying capability? And will it be good or bad for a country if its aggregate demand is over from what it can give?
They can give like, you mean like you have production possibilities, like, and your aggregate demand is higher than your supply opportunity? Like actually it's not, like I want to understand, like what is the question? Like, can I produce more if I have less amount of money? Do you mean that?
Yes.
In this case, like it's not possible. Like you can produce whatever you have. You can't produce more than actually you have. But if you are saying that my supplying like raw materials or supply opportunities are lower than general my aggregate demand, it means that your imports are higher. And in this case, it's already like bad negative impact on your economy. For the short term, maybe you will be able to satisfy, you will say, oh, okay, like how countries are taking loans from World Bank or other countries. Like you can take loans if you don't have enough supply and start to satisfy your human needs. However, for a long term, you can't survive and you will have a lot of problems. So basically, you can't request more than you are able to like supply for a long term, I mean. You're welcome.
And I think close to last question is, what would be the result if the government increases spending financed by borrowing or increasing the deficit?
Again, it's like depends of the amount of the borrowing. Like if they will, if the amount will be so high that deficit will have like a positive impact of the deficit, definitely you will have a positive changes in your economy and your GDP will start to increase. But if you have just a little amount of that and it's the magnitude is really low, in this case there will not be any positive changes. Like again, like this question is like I can answer it from two sides. If the magnitude, the amount is higher, all the spending that government will do for correcting this government deficit, it will be like beneficial, and for long term you will have a lot of results. If it's just like a little amount, it will not have any kind of impact and changes on it. For overall, yeah, if you are able to have enough amount, like spend enough amount resources for that, definitely you can correct the deficit and like start your economy with the higher and with the positive level.
Great, thank you. And last question. Let's say we have a society where all people do their housework alone, and one day they stop doing so and hire themselves to their next door neighbors. Won't this be shown in statistics as an increase in national production, whereas nothing actually changed?
It depends how much the government is able to collect all the data and calculate all the things. Like imagine if I'm going to buy something from my neighbor and there is no any cash recipient for that, and the government doesn't know about that because she didn't pay a tax for that, and I just gave him money and they make something for me. Definitely, realistically, there will not be any changes in my GDP. But if households will start to sell goods and they will pay taxes for that, so government will be able to calculate those consumptions and include it as a part of GDP, of course it will have a positive impact on it. This is the main problem that we actually have when there are like a lot of transactions between people, like consuming something, buying something, but there is no information about it and government is not able to calculate. That's why sometimes hidden economy, illegal economy make thousands of problems for the government, for both collecting taxes and understand the real picture of their countries.
Thank you very much for answering all the questions, Shavarsh.
My pleasure.
If you guys have any more questions, you can write them in the chat. But for now, would you like to have a break? How long would you like to rest for? Is 5 minutes okay? You can put pluses in the chat if that's more comfortable. Yeah, we can rest for 10 minutes if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so then we'll have a break for 10 minutes and come back at 7:10. So you can guys grab your water, have a break, rest, and then we'll be back. maybe just before that, we can answer the last question from Alberta. People are complaining about house market bubbles and the high housing prices. Should the government introduce policies to decreasing housing prices? If they do, real estate as a pillar of a country's economy will inevitably decline in GDP, GDP per capita, and people's living standards. What should the government do?
Can I know why the housing market bubble started to have higher prices? Is because of high demand, or they just started to provide all these services just for fun with higher prices? To be able to answer to your questions more specifically. If I have higher prices, why? Because of higher demand, or they just decided together to increase the prices without any reasons? If it's without reasons and it's not fair, government definitely will start to have restrictions, some regulations, and they will correct the market failure. If there is a high demand for that, in this case, government will not be able to give any kind of restrictions, because it's very natural. They are higher demand, and me as a supplier, I want to sell a little bit higher prices, and government can say, oh, you can't do increase the prices because there is higher demand and I'm able to increase my prices.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for answering. Right now we can go on to our break. You can rest for a little while, and we'll come back at 16:15 p.m. UTC. So in 10 minutes.
Okay.